When CIO magazine started their IT Hall of Fame, one of the founding inductees was our next speaker. Not only the father of the Sabre system, but as credited by Harvard Business School, the first CIO of the modern era. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Max Hopper.
Robert, thank you very much. I appreciate you having me here and look forward to our discussion this morning.
My pleasure, Max. So when Harvard Business School said that about you, what did they mean by the first CIO of the modern era?
Well, what I believe they meant was that I was maybe the first that took a broad view of how technology, IT technology primarily, could be applied to business situations. There'd been a number, I think, of predecessors that had introduced technology in the business scene, but I think what they give me credit for perhaps is taking it in a broader arena than perhaps my predecessors had in a more narrow sphere.
When you say broader arena?
Looking at not only the business but the customers and how they interacted, and to try to take it, asking maybe as a lot of the early IT folks were focused on hows, in my opinion, how technology works and how to make it work. I was focused as much as on the how, which I enjoyed, the what and the why. You know, what we were trying to accomplish and why we were doing it, because I thought if I understood the why as well as the how, I could do a better job, and really trying to create, the term is maybe overused, but competitive advantage or some advantage for the business.
So turning it from what was traditionally used to automate human functions, payroll or whatever, to something that actually drove the business forward.
Yeah, certainly in the early days, because of the limitations and what it could do and the time frames and everything else, about the only thing it could do was, look backwards and add up things. As fortunately, the era as I was coming along enabled us to use technology to interact in a real-time situation where you could actually affect the outcome of a current situation.
We're here in Texas right now. You were born in Texas, right?
I was.
Go back to when, where you grew up. Kind of tell us what life was like.
Oh, I'm not sure you really want to know. I actually was born in a countryside setting, small farms outside a little town down in East Texas called Lufkin. And I was actually born in a little log house at home. And those were kind of the situations. No electricity, no running water. I mean, that was where I spent a good part of my early, years. Now, by then we had actually built a couple of additional homes that were, not of logs, and electricity was brought in. Running water was not, but and that's where I started the school, in a little country school. In those years, which is right at the beginning of World War II, they did accelerate you. I think I was almost 7 when I started, and they put me through 4 grades in 2 years. That was the kind of thing they did, which from a social point of view should never have happened, but from at least because I ended up graduating from high school at 16. Now, we moved when actually the war started down to an industrial town on the coast of Texas, near Galveston, called Texas City. And I went all the way through high school there. It was a little more of an advanced school in that sense. And so I spent essentially then my early years as a child in Texas, learning Texan. I think my first trip out of the state, and those was when I was a high school senior. We went to, I was in the high school band, and we went to the Mardi Gras to represent the state, march in the Mardi Gras parade. So that was my first experience on a trip outside of Texas.
What did you play?
I played trombone.
You still?
No, my lip I don't think would be very much in a card, but I still enjoy jazz, and I played in a little jazz band, so I still can appreciate it a bit.
What was what was the first thing that could loosely be described as technology that you ever came across?
That was an interesting question. It would be the wall telephone. Now, back in, again, those days, very early, the telephone system was one still of central operator who you had a line that, ran out into the countryside. In the homes that had telephones, you had your ring, and so you had to listen. The operator would ring your ring if it was someone picking up, and of course the bane of those in those days was anytime any rang, everybody answered, so you had everybody in the countryside listening to your calls. But that's what I first remember, and some of the older kids knew how to. There was a transformer in there that would be lifted out. And if you did it just right, it could generate quite a jolt of electricity. And they used to do that to us younger kids to kind of initiate us into their world.
And what was the first time you ever came across a computer of any kind?
Close to it. When I was in the military, I was in a branch of the Army called the Army Security Agency, which
what
was
year was
this would have been the middle 50s. And they were involved in electronic surveillance, I guess would be the best way, kind of a branch of the National Security Agency. And I was stationed right outside of Washington, D.C., so in fact, some of the things I got involved in involved the National Security Agency. I was one of the few, or the early few, when Sputnik went up, that we were involved with trying to make sure we found out what it was about. And but there it was a lot of communications. We had of all types, but they were at least state-of-the-art. Everything, radio, teletypewriters, whole world of communications. But they also had some coding machines and encryption machines, which were early forerunners of. If you have done any study on the Enigma and those kinds of things, you know that. These were early applications of computer technology in that kind of world.
And so, after leaving the Army, did you go into a computer-related field?
No, I worked for Shell Oil before I went in, and then when I came back, I was at the Shell's research lab in Houston. And I'd been going to night school and continuing a degree and so on, and I ended up getting a degree, and I'd started playing around with computers that were around in those days. This would have been the late 50s. And even learning a little bit how to program. The first computer I ever learned to program on was a little step computer plug board called Burroughs Elecom, I think 101, for anybody that's ever heard of those kinds of things. But we had in the lab a UNIVAC computer that I fooled around with a bit, and then they asked me to go, essentially, in Houston, the research lab was out from town a ways. Downtown, they had what was called the Area Exploration Production Office, and they were getting a new 7070 computer, which is one of the first solid-state computers. They had an old 650, which was the vacuum tube computer, and asked me to join that crew as a kind of one of their first two people that were going to look at the what we might call the technical side, applying technology to the technical side of the business as opposed to the payroll and accounting and those kinds of things. And so I joined them, initially working on the 650 and then the 7070, and then we got a 1401, and I was charged with selling time, because it was more computer than was needed for the business functions, to the research lab and those environs. So I started out life and really in technology, being a seller of myself and computing time, and which I found, I think, instrumental. I mean, even looking going forward, if you immediately had customers you had to solve, or you didn't stick around, so to speak. And we applied a lot of early technology, which was one of the fun things. because with the research lab, you can appreciate they were kind of on the forefront of what we were looking at in terms of drilling and a host of both exploration and production type activities, and offshore and bidding. And then I got involved an awful lot in what turned out to be the bidding side of things, or the business side of things, working on things like risk management and budgeting and of capital investments, which discounted cash flows and things which were just starting to get thought of in business in those days. So a lot of fun things.
So were you ever a programmer?
I was the world's greatest programmer.
I think we all are.
I know. That's why I answered the question. I think anyone that's ever programmed has loved it. And I think it's been successful.
Right.
And when I said I was selling my services or selling services to the research lab, I was selling me, at least for the first year or two. And we won't go into my technical exploits, but they were good. So,
what languages were you using?
Oh, in those days, gosh, we were using on the I'll go to the 7070 because it was the biggest. We used initial Fortran. We had an awful lot of what would have been assembly language,
right.
and what we would call assembly language on that machine. 1401, you really had to do it in assembly language. So, Fortran in some of the technical applications, because they saw the, let's say, mathematical approaches a lot better. COBOL was just coming along the scene for the business applications. There were a couple of, so I did some programming in COBOL, but mostly I would say in the early years where I did most of it was either Fortran or assembly language, what we would call assembly language.
How long were you at Shell?
I was at Shell, including military experience, because I counted about 13 years.
Well, okay.
And I left Shell in 1967.
And when you were at Shell, though, is it true that you hired the first female programmer?
Well, as far as I know, as I said, I was successful at the selling my services, so I needed somebody to help me out. And I hired, in those days, the oil business was not very kind to females.
Right.
And I hired a female to come in and assist me.
How did it work out?
It worked great. She was a very, very capable person. And then later, when I moved to New York with Shell, and in another role, I hired a number of females, and as far as I know, promoted the first female to a manager's role in IT in Shell.
Wow. And after Shell?
1967, I joined a little firm. There were maybe 150 people at the time, called EDS.
I've heard of them.
And Ross Perot. And and spent a few, exciting learning years there. So, and that's what got me into the airline.
Is that where you met Bob Crandall for the first time?
Yes. Now he wouldn't remember meeting me in that circumstance. We may be jumping ahead just a little bit, but in 1970, January, I think 1970, I'd spent about 2 years with EDS working at United, and we can maybe talk a little bit about that. But we were calling the vice president of EDS that kind of was leading this, plus me, calling on TWA to they were having same problems with their computer system at the time that United had just had. Talk about those if you want. And when we called on the president and the, I think, senior VP of finance of TWA, they informed us that they weren't ready to quite make a decision because they were getting ready to bring a new CIO in. We didn't have the title CIO in those days. And that name was Bob Crandall. And then later on, about 3 or 4 months later on, where EDS did make a run at trying to operate their reservation system. When we talk about that, Bob was opposed to it, and he and Ross Perot debated it in a board meeting at TWA, which Ross lost, and I met Bob at least perfunctorily at that time.
So before computers played a role in reservations for the airlines, how did the airlines handle reservations?
Well, certainly manually was the way of saying it. But it evolved into multiple stages. American had a very forward-looking chairman, and C.R. Smith. I think you got to give him credit for a lot of things. Not only he, before World War II, he did the DC-3. I mean, he was the guy that had Douglas build the DC-3, the old tail dragger, and should be given credit for that. When the war started, he left American and went in and ran what was then the part of the Army Air Force that dealt with logistics. And he became somewhat enamored with the use of punch cards and those kinds of things and keeping track of things. He had a very good systems mind. And so after the war, when he rejoined American, he created, or allowed to be created, in the marketing department of American, a sort of R&D group. And they actually created, using essentially telephone drum technology, the ability to store essentially a limited number of flights and the amount of seats that were available. So you could get yes, no. It's a very basic inventory system. And so American employed that initial version somewhere around 1950.
Right.
And I think a piece of it is maybe still in the Smithsonian. I think we had that. From there, and he, they, in the reservation offices, because they were very much regional or localized because of communication costs and everything else, and the flights, they would, he instituted punch cards equipment, whereby they had a rolling belt, would be the best way I could describe it, where the agents would take the phone call. They could look at usually a board. They had a whiteboard. This was before they had the computer terminals, and actually with binoculars to see if there were seats available. Later on, with the advent of the early little computer there, they had a little terminal, that device that would give them a red or a green light, I think, if they wanted to, could check on that, key it in. And then they would take the customer data, put it right in on a card, put it on the belt. The belt would go back. It'd be key punched, and then put on a list, if you will, for the flight. And then they could use that at the gate, quote, or at actually the foot of the plane in many cases, to check you on or off the airplane. So that is, in a sense, what was happening in the 50s. American actually ended up building a second version of that, which Bunker Ramo bought, or the rights to, and actually then commercialized it, and a lot of other airlines utilized it back in the mid-50s up until, many cases past the mid-60s.
So the term check-in then was just literally checking somebody off the list.
Exactly. And of course there were no seat assignments.
Right.
Or if they did, it was based on some limited ability of keeping track of things.
And so C.R. Smith, goes back in the
He does.
folklore. Right?
Well, not only folklore. Then in the there was another gentleman named Smith who was an IBM salesman. An honest, true story. They were on an American flight, and and got to talking, and long story short, American and IBM developed a relationship. This was probably, I think, mid-50s. Technology wasn't there yet, but about 3 years later, finally the combination of the two of them together got a project going where IBM was willing to put in some money, and American was, and they started this effort, which culminated in the advent of Sabre. Now that had a couple of hiccups too. When they initially tried to turn it on, it didn't work. Capacity issues, so they had to go in and make some other changes, and it wasn't until 1964 that it really became live.
And that was the first ACP system?
No, that was a pre-runner, or a forerunner, if you want to call it, to ACP. If I just a little history, and I know we're going maybe into more depth than you want. IBM, after they got American involved, they started looking at that industry and getting others involved. You may remember that IBM had 3 computer lines prior to the 360 advent in 64. They were developing Sabre on the 7090 series, 70990, which was essentially a scientific computer, because it was the only one that had the power, or enough processing power, they thought, to support what they were trying to do. They actually upgraded it, and part of the name of Sabre came from the fact they had IBM had worked with Strategic Air Command in building something called SAGE, which was the early warning system that they installed across Canada, radar system in those days. And SAGE stood for Semi-Automated Ground Environment. And they had very high capacity drums and a high I/O throughput, again using some modified version of 709 computers. Translate to Sabre, we ended up, the original Sabre system had these big drums to handle the I/O and the throughput required in a very advanced system for an airline of American size in those days. IBM also, though, because they saw that perhaps as a fine way to get in the industry, started almost 3 or 4 parallel developments. One was with Pan Am on the 7080, 705, 7080 series, another computer generation. And another was with Delta on the 7070 series. So they had those 3 marching kind of along, trying to, obviously in those days IBM was involved as much in the application as they were in the technology. Very shortly, with the 360, they started a 4th. And the 4th was a small version of the knowledge they'd gained on all of those, and they developed a base program system called ACP. And that was initially made for small airlines, Frontier, Braniff, and so on. Another immediate parallel and follow-on out of that was IPARS for the international portion of taking those. So those are kind of the steps. One more step, Eastern needed, again, a large replacement. They had, I think, part of the old Bunker Ramos stuff. So they took worked with IBM, took the PARS, the ACP-based PARS system for small airlines, spent additional money to upgrade it to a large airline system. So that's a little bit of that history. Now, step in a little further. American Sabre system shook up the marketplace. American gained a revenue share of 1% when they introduced Sabre, which was kind of unheard of in the industry. And the reason being, it enabled, for the first time, instant confirmation on seats, as opposed to having to wait, in many cases, for days. And it had, not only American flights, but some connecting flights and those kinds of things, so you could look at things in a more holistic way. United, of course, was the big, American had about 12% market share in those days. I think United had more like 18. They had enabled themselves to fall behind. They'd actually used a series of RCA computers to take those reservation cards and kind of marry it to their Bunker-Ramos system for inventory. Was their way of trying to do things. So they had actually moved in a computer way. But they elected to go with UNIVAC. And UNIVAC, this would have been, again, about 64, 65, had two versions of computer systems, both real-time, 494s and 1108s, and the 1108s bigger. And they were the first actual, or close to the first actual multiprocessing systems that were around, using multiple processors. And so United took a very grandiose approach. They were not going to only incorporate their reservation system, but also all the airline operation systems and many of what they called maintenance, control, and information system, which focused on the management of spare parts of all environs, including the airplanes that were composed of the spare parts, as a way of managing the airline. Everything but what you might think of as the financial payroll systems and so on. This was a big project. The flaw, as it turned out, because this was one I got involved in. I got involved with EDS, and we started working for United in, would have been early 1968. And the reservation system project was going on in Chicago, as well as some of the operational systems. I got involved in the inventory system, the parts inventory system, because part of my operations research stuff had been on inventory management way back. And we eventually were moved to Chicago and got involved in the project altogether, including the reservation side and so on. And it had major capacity problems. It had been sold in those days, and people really didn't understand real-time processing to such a degree. Unfortunately, American had learned a little bit with IBM on theirs, but it didn't get translated across the industry very far. And the UNIVAC guys and the United guys didn't know any better. And they told them they were going to put 4 processors out there. The way they calculated throughput, they got 4x. Well, we've learned the hard way. You never get 4x. And so, long story short, that became a failed project. We had a small team, probably 6 or 8 of us, again, focusing primarily on the maintenance and engineering, those kinds of activities. When we moved to Chicago, they immediately asked us to get involved in the performance issues. And we had a couple of people at EDS that had been involved with Sabre. And we brought them in and started applying what today would be capacity management, key things to it, trying to identify the causes and solutions. And we advised them, I guess this would have been 69 or so, that it was unlikely they could make it work, that, it wasn't 4x, it's probably only 2-point-something x at that. And that was for the reservation side, and then you added all the other things. It just was, UNIVAC, of course, was kind of panicked, and they looked at stripping out the communication portion of it, which no story with American later, and IBM even, and putting front-end 1108s in front of the 1108s. And even that didn't give it enough capacity. So it was on New Year's Day. I met with the CEO of United Airlines and suggested to him that he had a failed approach and it was not going to work. And he accepted it, and actually, one of the key senior guys at United had been involved with us as a part of a very small team looking at this for the, several months doing, it wasn't one-time thing. I mean, we'd done a lot of work. And so he charged us with, I have a letter of intent, still a copy of it, to allow EDS to operate their reservation system, to build a new one and go forward and so on. And so we embarked on it in early 1970 and ended up choosing the site in Denver, which was, in accordance with some of United's wishes. They gave us that later has become the site. And actually, one of the guys that reported to me spent, even after the relationship broke up for various reasons, I'll talk in a minute, spent months out there kind of shepherding, getting everything set up and going, and the center built and so on. So at that same time, just to backtrack a bit, TWA had the same issue with American and United. They decided that they would go with the Burroughs. Burroughs had a computer in those days called a 5500 that was a very slick computer. And Burroughs was introducing a solid-state memory extension of that. It had, I think it's solid state, something anyway. It was going to generate tons of throughput. They had done some multiprocessing type solutions that were going to be put in, and TWA called their project George. And so that was the one that was in trouble. When we called on TWA right after we had the letter of intent with United to build out United's, because we thought if we could put them together, and we knew American was having some major problems, we might get all three together and really create an industry solution. So that was the goal, the concept in 1970 from my point of view. When we were to finalize the contract with United, EDS, you probably don't remember this, but in those days there were still prisoners of war in North Vietnam, and Ross was very much a patriot, still is, and he chartered the big orange pumpkin from Braniff's, the 747, to quote, he was delivering presents, Christmas presents, still are presents to the POWs, and of course he was flying around. Put it bluntly, he was flying around the world. We had a final negotiation with United. They offered us a fixed cost plus situation. EDS had recently gone public about 2 or 3 months before that. And long story short, couldn't stomach the fact with their investment banker that we should do, in those days, a cost-plus deal because of the concern about what the market implication was, and we couldn't get in touch with Ross. So United says, well, sorry, it's either this or not. And the executive VP of United, Curtis Barkus, was the finance guy, and he had already told us, and it was just one of those things that the president then of EDS could not bring himself to make that decision without Ross. So I think in terms of what that led to, that was probably one of the times in my life when I felt that I had done so much to build something, and then it got removed, and it would have been a good deal. Ross later obviously had conversations, and he liked to use football metaphors. He said, "You had it down to the half-yard line. I couldn't get it across," because subsequent to that, then we had been in negotiations or having discussions with TWA. Ross wanted to take, the learnings we had, even though United had pushed it down, and bring back the fore of that. And Bob Crandall was now head of DP at their IT at TWA. he did not want to have an outsider, involved in his IT world. And so that got shut down. Interesting thing was, we still were doing work for TWA. I did an expert witness report for TWA on all the George materials for their attorneys back in those days. So I got to peek in a little bit of all of them. I ended up, just to get back to the technology side, when United, we were probably going to take the standard IBM PARS code and take it forward. We thought we had enough technical expertise to do it, because even when we had looked at the Eastern code, and there was a reasonably high cost for the Eastern code in those days, I think it was $1 million or something like that, we didn't think it offered a lot more than the few capacity things that we knew had to fix, and some of the others that we could take the IBM standard PARS and make it better. And so EDS was focused in that direction. When we pulled, or when that relationship severed, United, in an endeavor to, because they wanted to make it easy, they ended up choosing the PARS choosing the Eastern version and implementing it, and then modifying it to do some of the same things that we would have done. TWA also bought the Eastern version, kind of, tie the knot, and tied it in. They named it PARS. Okay. But both were based on the Eastern version.
And was there a time, though, I mean, I read that there was almost a bake-off between the Burroughs system and the IBM system at TWA. And
well, when Bob came in,
right.
And
he pulled the plug on it or something?
Yeah, he ended up pulling the plug, but we knew it was going to be pulled anyway. I mean, there was no way, looking at it and knowing what had gone on, and knowing that the Burroughs system, when we got at least the ability to, because we were doing, some due diligence, I guess, to make we knew that it wasn't going to make it, either from an application point of view. They were way behind where they thought they were or needed to be, and then from a capacity point of view, and they never really got the operating system to work on that new Burroughs system. I mean, so there were problems all along the way.
And so you had United, TWA, and Eastern all on the same code base.
Yeah.
American, Pan Am, Delta?
Okay. American. American knew they had some problems. American, they had internal political problems at American. CR retired to become Secretary of Commerce in the Johnson administration the last year or so. The supposed successor, unfortunately, ended up with cancer, and so they turned to a reasonably weak guy who had been the attorney, the lawyer. In American, the conflicts over Sabre, began with CR. He put Sabre under the finance department. As I said before, the early work had an R&D group that was in the marketing department. That marketing department was still operating and still going forward. So even when Sabre became operational in '64, there were still people fighting it. As long as CR stuck around, it was his baby, and they didn't, try to disrupt it too much. But when he retired, they really, set out. So American had run into capacity issues on the old 7090. They'd put a 360 front end in to do some of that, to handle part of it. They had done things like Sabre Talk, which was an early version of PO1, or an offshoot of PO1 to take the application code up to a higher level. Done a lot of things. They were very creative, very forward-thinking, in terms of the use of technology. Looked at, remove the communications from the, the host process. A lot of things I think are architecturally right. And they struck a deal with Eastern. This would have been, late 60s, where American had the rights to the Eastern code, okay, in exchange for Sabre Talk. Plus, they did joint development on the first pricing system, which was a very needed capability. So American had access to the Eastern code. In early 1970, after after United thing essentially fell apart, and then we were unable to get the TWA follow-on situation, I was faced with a choice then of, all the work I'd been putting in and trying to build in terms of the concept of an industry airline approach, piece to EDS, of going back, probably moving back to Dallas, and in those days you had to move on your own, and a whole host of other things, and kind of starting probably back over in the healthcare side of things, which I had been initially involved in, and had been so far now gone. And United, Curtis Barkus again, he was faced with the decision of whether to sue UNIVAC or find some other approach. And so he approached me personally if I would join United, if I thought I could, if they didn't sue UNIVAC and took an offer which was like, 10 or 20 cents on the dollar, something like that for the hardware, if it could be used for those operational systems that had been, carried forward, including some of the maintenance stuff, in a cost-effective way. In other words, was it a step forward over where they were, and with a low-cost approach, could it work? And he offered me the opportunity to come in and take over that effort. And they did not have part of the outcome of our work had been they had an overriding, what we would call a CIO today. He was a gentleman that had come from one of their engineering groups and really didn't know computing, and they had early example of someone trying to lead a technology in an early technology setting without a technology background, didn't know questions to ask, and so forth. And unfortunately had been let go or retired. And so they didn't have a CIO. And so Curtis offered me the opportunity to report to him. We continued the effort out in Denver, and he offered me, I could have gone out there, but it didn't make sense. I didn't want to, I was in Chicago. Yeah. And we had a pretty good guy, one of the guys that had, a guy named Don Larson, I don't know if you ever heard the name, that we thought was one of the best ones there to go out and lead the effort anyway. We still got asked on questions, even though I stuck around there for a long time, even after it wasn't a bad party in that sense. And they had the original group in Chicago. And so he said, you make this successful, you can, we'll look at reassembling, you can be, unfortunately he retired with it. I said retired, he got retired, they brought in a new CEO. CEO lost his job too, which had not been part of the cards. A little later, they brought in the hotel guy from Seattle to take over United. But anyway, those are how the world's changed, right. And so forth. So I joined United. Ross was kind enough to let me be the first guy to go to work for a customer, given all the things, and we're successful in bringing forward essentially all the operational stuff we had on the ground, and over about a 2-year period, a little less than 2 years, got it all turned on and running, and there were still a lot of developments to be done. One of the things I did, though, we had a flight following system that really is, I don't know if you know what flight following is, but once you make a flight plan it enables you to track the aircraft according to that plan, and it's a very necessary part of operating an airline. That had been a standalone early version at United, and we integrated that in with all the other operational systems there. And so in my discussions with American, they did not have one that was in any sense working. So I ended up selling the use of that system. I don't know if I sold them the system, I've forgotten. My old system for them to use as a replacement. That's how I got involved a lot with the American guys. So in early '72, American was trying to get Sabre integrated. They'd moved to Tulsa. They had established a center in Tulsa. This was in the intervening 70 to 72 time frame.
And before that, they were in New York.
Yeah, the Brackliff Manor, New York, was up the Hudson where they put the original Sabre. It was up close to IBM. Part of it, I don't know, lovely little hill overlooking the Hudson. One of the first modern data centers with backup power and air conditioning. I remember in those days, obviously with Shell and so forth, I was involved an awful lot early on with their physical environments, and we didn't even think of anything that sophisticated. And of course, we didn't quite have a 24/7 issue that the airlines did. So long story short, in that sense, American was trying to get their version of Eastern Pars converted to look like the original Sabre system. And they were having difficulty figuring out how to move Sabre essentially from one system to the other, even if they got it to work. Guy they had running Sabre, that part of Sabre, the CIO, if you want to think of it, was in New York, but this was just the reservation piece of it, was a gentleman that was a great engineer, but again, wasn't a technologist. And one of the things at least I'd learned in the United experience, because we'd moved what were 4 or 5 real-time systems from one environment to another, and we had to learn to do it seamlessly or close to seamlessly and so on. And so they were impressed that, if I could do those. So long story short, they asked me if I would consider joining American, because in the thing at United, as I said, my mentor had, when they brought in the new CEO, Curtis was asked to retire. And so here I was, a guy that had created havoc in United's ranks, gotten, some people that were in good stead let go, and maybe even thought maybe, the CEO. So it wasn't an environment where I was going to, succeed very much. And they were doing good in the reservation side. It wasn't that I hadn't accomplished everything they needed to be accomplished. But anyway, long story short, I joined American in early 1972. So that's how I got there.
And when did they move to Tulsa, and why Tulsa?
Well, Tulsa had already been chosen, and there were 2 primary reasons. First was communication cost. In those days, you got to remember, that was before deregulation and of the telephone industry in any way. MCC was just a dream, so to speak. And in fact, we became one of the first users of that, if you want to think about it. So the communication costs in the center of the country were a lot lower on an average per mile basis than they were in the New York suburbs, which had to stretch the West Coast. So it was a huge cost savings. Second, they didn't have any space in Brackliff. They would have had to add on, or the physical pieces of equipment for the original Sabre system. The old 7090s, the drums were huge, and so there was no physical space left. And third, I said there were 2, there were really 3. City of Tulsa offered an inducement. I've forgotten, something like $20 million or some amount of money for us to, American, to relocate. We had the space, the physical space there on the maintenance base. We had property. And so it made sense from all those reasons to build it there.
So when you joined Sabre, or American, I guess, AMR, they were in Tulsa?
They had started the center in Tulsa.
Right.
In fact, when I joined, they were still going through, we still had checklists of the building. And we were just getting the computers installed. And then my first task was to work out a plan to move them and to assess the readiness of the system and those kinds of things and get it moved. And so that was, my initial role.
And how smoothly did that go?
Well, not as smoothly as you'd like. Two or three things. One, we did figure out or came up with a plan for moving it, and which involved essentially doing a data capture on the old system in New York, and using a private jet to fly what would have been tapes in those days to Tulsa, reload the system, and bring it live on the new system. We pretty well spec'd that out. We had tested everything we could test except for a capacity test. And I indicated there had still been issues with the marketing department. And what we decided to do was do it on a Saturday night, Sunday morning, because those were let's say, the least active times for the airline. Our backup plan, by the way, because in those days we still were using teletypewriters as their terminals, was for all the agents to save their copy so they could re-enter stuff. I asked for a capacity test, and in those days, I was located in Tulsa. My boss, who was the equivalent of what we call a CIO, was in New York. There were two or three of us that reported to him that had various responsibilities. And he reported to the head of finance, but you only had 4 or 5 senior officers, so those kinds of issues got discussed at that level in those days. So, I argued very vehemently for a volume test or capacity test, and the head guy in marketing that had headed that R&D, and he had all the marketing support functions as well. Another interesting guy, Rod King. I could tell you a lot of stories about Rod. He wouldn't do it. He would not. He was not going to pay overtime to have people, re-enter and to try that. So I warned him, and so we set up a plan so that if indeed we couldn't make the cutover appropriately, that we would have a fallback, which was using that. So we got the tapes captured. We got it. I remember it had been on 9 o'clock on Sunday morning. Flipped the switch because we had one of these, kind of imaginary. Well, we had painted switch. A lot of fun stuff we were trying to do, and ran. And then we started in the afternoon noticing a few little problems and had some chains breaking in there. And we shut it down about 6, and they spent the night, doing what we warned them they would, likely have to do if they didn't give us so. So then we got, a couple of volume tests, so to speak, and we brought it back up, and I think in less than a month. We'd identified the problem. If we had known immediately what the problem was, we probably could have fixed it without, but you just didn't want to risk, taking the business down. And so, like I say, we got it going, and as far as I know, it's been running ever since. We've had a couple of hiccups that were, lengthy, but nothing that were that threatening. The technology side of Sabre, as you may remember, we started out on the old 7090s when we converted over to PARS, or Eastern PARS. We were on the System 360 series, and we were on the largest computer at that time. I think was or close to it, the 65, if I recall. But then when we went into the travel agent side of things in early 1967, and we kind of leaped ahead of United and started offering our system, we recognized we were going to have capacity issues or performance issues. I mean, we'd had a team doing that all along the way as we were using it for internal purposes, and we knew that was going to be the case. And so IBM kept bringing out or came out with some new boxes. In fact, we were one of the first to use every new box I think they brought out. MDAL came into the mix. We were one of the first folks to use an MDAL box to try to grow. We had, our communications was in a front end as opposed to being in the mainframe, and we went through a series of vendors on our communications front ends. When we first started putting a lot of travel agencies online, we had started out to upgrade the communication front ends with something called TI 990s, if my memory's right on the model number. And we ran into a little bit of a hiccup and had to suspend actually installations for a while we fixed that problem. And that was one of many we pushed on. And finally, we reached a situation with the IBM mainframes where a single box couldn't hold us, and we knew we had to move into a multiprocessor approach. And so we actually worked out a deal with Eastern and TWA and United. Here we were all competitors, maybe with the exception of Eastern. I don't think they'd quite chosen to get in the market yet. But we all had the same problem. And at least IBM worked with us, and we developed jointly, and I think American spearheaded the effort, a multiprocessor version of ACP to enable us at least to get by the capacity crunch that we were all facing. So this would have been 77-ish, 78 timeframe. After that, we were then faced with the realization that we didn't want to, any of us, want to own the maintenance of an operating system. And so we worked out an agreement whereby we would, I think we ended up giving it to IBM, for them taking it over, making it a standard product, which became TPF. And of course, then we were obviously paying for it through maintenance and through license fees and so forth. But at least it became a standard product, one that would support their product line going forward, and one that would give us, we could count on as obviating that part of our performance issues. The TI 990s as a communications front end, I think, only lasted a few years before we had to start replacing them. I think we eventually ended up replacing with DECVAX and then Microvax processors. So that's kind of the technology story. With one exception, we later tried Eastern and ourselves, and then a couple of the other airlines joined us with IBM to take the application code, PARS application code, and redo it from stem to stern in a more, let's say, professional way, one that would enable things we call today systems-oriented architectures and so forth. And the price tag came in high enough that we thought we couldn't support it ourselves. We even tried to find a couple of venture folks to help fund it. We never could, so that idea never made it off the ground. So we all ended up still with their own versions of application code. So that's roughly the story of that that part of the enterprise that where we were involved in.
You said that, and this kind of ties back to the conversation we had before about porting TPF and does IBM own it. You said that you gave it to IBM. So was it owned by those airlines?
Well, we spent all the money to do the development work, the operating system. So we took the ACP application and then upgraded it to a multi-processor version. Now, it was, again, within what we did. They watched over our shoulder, but then we gave it to them, and then they took that and redid it, if you want to think of it. But the good chunk of, who knows how much software they wrote or rewrote, but at least they had the conceptual ways, and they turned it into a product, which we all needed. So it was a way of funding it where they wouldn't fund it. The best of the challenges, when we brought Sabre live for travel agents, and this would have been late 76 or so, and again, the marketplace we were in, American was a small carrier in terms of footprint compared to United. We knew that we needed to get others involved with us. It was TWA had come into the marketplace. There were others still on the sideline in the marketplace. There were still some multi-access vendors trying to go forward. So it was a pretty mixed marketplace there for a couple of years trying to get sorted out. Our goal was to try to build allegiances with other carriers. So we came up with a concept that did a couple of things, maybe 3 or 4 unique things in the marketplace at that time. One thing it did was make the other airlines partners with Sabre, in that in certain locales they could in effect represent Sabre as their product, and in return for that we modified the availability display in such a way that on flights that were non-competitive with American, that they would be given a preference. So this was the first case of at least us selling shelf space. Now I might back up just a minute and talk about availability displays. When the marketplace started, in whatever it was, 76 or so, and we went into the market because United was going to offer their internal product, their internal airline product. They and most others had an availability display that was a very static display that had been developed by the OAG folks. And it, in effect, had United's non-stops and directs first on one display. Then it would show their multi-stops. And maybe in the third or fourth screen, if you went at it, you could get other airline information and displays. This was fairly cumbersome in terms of that, but that was a major economic reason that American decided to go into the marketplace. We knew our product wouldn't be on the shelf to sell if that version came into being. We had a dynamic display, and by that it checked all the flights that we put in a bucket to be checked, and chose the best flights that matched the customer's desired departure time in terms of minimum elapsed time, whether it was a direct flight, nonstop, or multi-stop, and tried to present that as a best service. Now, we had done that internally because, again, some of our old terminals at res offices had been the teletypewriter terminals, and we did not have a fast method of refreshing stuff. So our whole method was to have a best process approach. And in terms of for travel agents, it turned out to be the best as well. So when we moved into a sort of a worldwide OAG with all the flights of all the carriers and had worked out agreements with them to sell their inventory, we guaranteed on that first screen they would find the best service from wherever it was, whichever airline that was buying, or that had the capability, in terms of, again, of that least travel time for desired departure time. In those days, since pricing was still in a regulated environment, pricing wasn't the key instrument. Time was in those days. That was a key measurement. Now, we chose to say that if American had a flight within 1 hour of that best departure time, we would list it ahead of the other. That was our approach to giving us some credit for having invested the money in the marketplace. And so we had that, quote, advantage of shelf space. Not dissimilar to what you see if you go into a grocery store and the bread from that particular grocer is going to be right at eye level. So it was the same basic concept we deployed there. So it became natural then for us to say to a potential partner, we're going to give you that same advantage in locales that you sponsor, and by sponsor they had to pay about half the cost that it was costing us to have a location that, quote, they responsible for. So that was one thing we did that was sort of unique and first in the industry. Second thing we did, we started, they had to pay us a transaction fee, and we paid them a transaction fee. So for other partners, ourselves and those that were partners, they all agreed, and it was a fairly limited transaction fee, but they would pay us if it was an American flight that got in an itinerary from that locale that they sponsored, and vice versa. And we carried that throughout. So it became the first fee-based situation in the what then were, we didn't call them GDSs, but what became the travel agent world. So those are, I think, two of the things that were put into play. Now, we did give them an opportunity also to buy a piece of Sabre at then current market valuations, and we'd do all kinds of whatever necessary to buy it. We only had one person, U.S. Air, that ever, I think, seriously looked at the possibility of doing it. And in all those time frames, they could have bought it at what would have been, rock bottom prices compared to what later became very much an economic capability. I will say this: the idea that we had of charging fees eventually kicked, and using the availability display. The other carriers eventually came around to using more dynamic displays because they were just non-competitive in the marketplace and had to. And then they started using those fees in a very disadvantaged way to certain other carriers. And for that, the CAB ultimately stepped in and said, no more. You're going to have neutral displays and can't charge a premium in that particular marketplace. Of course, when they did that and put the CAB rules in place, that we at least called them that, they did allow standard transaction fees to be put in place, which got put in at a much higher rate than had been put in at the others in a very straightforward way, which really finally put the GDSs in a very competitive business scenario, so they weren't having to depend on generating supplemental airline revenues to cover the operating costs. And the pricing of the terminals had been driven down by competition to a level that the travel agents weren't paying their fair share either. So that's just a few of the changes that came in. I'd comment too on two or three other technological things that if you were, I think, writing, if patents had been allowed then, that Sabre would have done very well on. One was the fact that when the travel agents needed an ability to account for their have an accounting system for all their travel products sold. There were a couple of basic concepts that were out there that not only handled the accounting and determined how much they had to pay, but also provided all the documentation. Printing tickets, because in those days you didn't have many ticket printers or anything, not in a common way, and providing itineraries, invoices, pretty much standard business stuff. And they had started this. We made a promise, because that was part of the original Jickers work that needed to be done, that we would provide that. And we spent about $1 million with a company up in Canada to do that internally in Sabre. They had a mini computer system they were running, and our commitment was that we would not make it only a Sabre central site, because quite frankly I didn't want to, but didn't feel I had much choice, but also make it a local processing option that we could tie into. Well, one of the things we did at Sabre was design all the communication protocols and work processes and those kinds of things that later became standard in the industry that enable those things to work together. So that was if we had been able to patent, that would have been a great patent, because it would have paid off long term. Another thing that we did and were first in was the use of what you might call an electronic Rolodex. Was the thing we call it. It was, I've forgotten, the STAR system, I think is what Sabre called it. It enabled multiple levels of stored stuff to be moved into the P&R. It was a way of keeping track of customers that were frequent customers, so that the data didn't have to be re-entered, and it was put in, like I say, about 3 steps, so you could have a company, department, and then individuals, and manage it that way. And that was, again, an idea that was one of those things that really happened. Now, sort of a little sideline on that one. There was an unintended consequence. It came about, maybe almost, maybe even, I don't know, 10 years later, when American, we were in the midst then of those things. How do you keep track of frequent customers and travelers and so forth? And we had an old system built on trying to track past date P&Rs or people that had flown, and you could never match them up. They used different names or whatever, and it's just impossible to do it on a, maybe 60% was a better, as good a basis as you could have. American was also the only company, airline in those days, that did what we would call post-departure checkout. So they would go in after a flight, and usually end of day in those days where it was a precedent, and check all flown passengers against ticketed passengers. And for passengers that had not flown, we would cancel downline space to free up for other sales. We thought it made sense. Again, many other carriers didn't. We had our check-in processes working to such a degree, we decided, well, we should do it in real time. In other words, instead of waiting to end the day, we'd do it at departure time, right after departure time of the flights. And so we implemented that. And this was, I think, around 1980, if my memory's right. And we were, after we did that, the guy that headed application development for me, a guy named Roger Pickering, great guy, he came up with the idea. He expressed to me, why don't we tie those two together? Why don't we tie our STAR system together with this post-departure checkout, and check, put in the STAR system our frequent customers, and therefore we'll know if they flew or not, and we can now reward them, because I think at that time Western was giving 11 for 10. If you had 10 flights, you got 11. So a great thinker Roger was. And so standing in a line at the, I guess at the Learning Center, with Bob Crandall going to sort of a luncheon that we were all going to for some reason, I don't remember why, little buffet kind of thing. Roger said, I talked to Bob, mentioned, I said, yeah, great idea, let's take it forward. So we sat there in line and talked, went through, sat down, kind of drew it on a napkin, how we would tie them together. Bob called our marketing guy over. We went back to Bob's office, all signed non-disclosures, got the legal guy in, and we created a team of about 20 people. And 6 months later, we rolled out Advantage program. And that's, again, something that where it was an unintended consequence is something that, we did essentially for the travel agents, it tied together with something we did inside, and then had a great guy like Roger that thought of an idea that we brought forward and made happen. So those are just some of the things we did from a technology point of view that, you probably never hear of, that never got brought through. But again, if we could have patented stuff, they would have been, any one of the three would have made us some money along the way. When we rolled Sabre out initially, our concept was that the travel agent would pay enough of a fee to at least cover the cost of the equipment and the service. And we had calculated that, that there were enough economic benefits in it for the travel agents to be able to afford that was part of the deal, and so on. Now, it wasn't too long till, again, with, I don't know if there's our superior selling because, systems weren't quite there yet, but we were out at least installing, and others weren't, that they started attacking us on a price front and gradually drove that fee down. Never totally drove it all the way, but it drove it below at least economic break even on the from the travel agent portion of the fee to, that they paid to us. On the other hand, our competitors were in the same boat. They weren't using any cheaper equipment and didn't have any cheaper anything else. And so, again, you remember our reason for going into it was defensive, because we did not feel that our product would be on the shelf of the other guys, and so we'd definitely lose revenue. And so this was a cost avoidance was our major goal, and then to break even on the other. And then if we ever, because we were giving ourselves a little bit of a plus in the availability side, if we ever generated revenue, that was a double plus for us. Those were the kind of economic thoughts as we went into it. Our measurements showed that at least we were generating some revenue. There's always a debate, I did it in marketing, but anyway, we did get a revenue rise out of the travel agent locations. And we got data so that we could use and go back and talk to the travel agents about who they were using that got furnished to our sales department. So maybe they did push a little bit that way, but the long story short is we did generate extra revenue from Sabre travel agents. So that was a net positive that way. The fact that the cost of the travel agents kept declining, at least in those early years to some degree, led us to try to have the airlines who were getting a free ride, because they weren't kicking in anything. And the original Jickers concept, they would have paid half. And so we were starting to assess fees to car rental companies and hotels. So we were trying to find a way to get some of the airlines to also contribute to the total situation, knowing that long term it had to have an economic viability associated with it. So that's the way the early fee structure started and then worked out. And like I say, after the CAB rules came into place, they allowed essentially a higher fee to be charged to the airlines. Then they became almost the sole cost, which, as time went on, inevitably in its consequences, as deregulation came and airlines paid excess commissions and a whole bunch of sins that they committed, and free Sabre and free Apollo and all of those kinds came into place. Well, that had an abrupt reversal as well. And so I think we're back now into a more pragmatic world where airlines do pay fee for using it, and you have to bid on it, and travel agents have to pay fees for using it, and you bid on it. So it's I think we're in a much more real economic world than we may have been in some of the early learning situations.
How did the American Airlines Sabre system become the GDF?
That's another long, that's a semi-involved story, and I don't know how. Again, let's talk about the fact that the travel agents had a major portion of the distribution of airline seats. In those days, it was about 40% for most, but let's say in terms of international carriers, it'd be up 60-70%. We had what we call commercial accounts, which were internal businesses operating their own travel departments, and they, for major companies, did a reasonable size. We probably had 20-25% market share in those kinds of things, as opposed to those that came directly to our res office as individuals or as companies. So you can think of them as distribution channels, people calling in or dealing with an intermediary or doing it directly. Even starting in the late 60s, there had been a couple of attempts to create a system that travel agents could use that had some form of automation with it. There was a very much an early one that the AOG folks had proposed, using teletypewriters and microfiche as approaches to doing it, which failed. And then there were a couple of automated approaches that were essentially based on PARS-based technology. You got a lot of problems, trying to create an industry approach. You got to remember, in those days, the airlines were regulated. The CAB had tight control over everything you could do, and the relationships with travel agents and everybody else. I mean, you couldn't sneeze without asking for permission and what to do. And at least one of the efforts involved use of IBM technology. UNIVAC and a bunch of others protested that weren't fair. Long story short, for political reasons and I think economic reasons to some degree, those efforts failed. And this was in parallel with, you can think of United just getting technology in 71 based on PARS, TWA also 71, 72. American in transition over that time frame, a lot of the smaller carriers and others. So, I mean, it was, the airlines had their hands full. So in the 74-5 time frame, if I can use that framework, there were various others that then decided, well, maybe, the time is ripe to find a solution to enable the travel agents to have a methodology of dealing with it. And there were two or three that actually formulated plans to bring it forward. One group came, and because the role I had at American in those days, dealing with the technology for Sabre and so forth, was the one that I got to interface with these guys. And there was one group that I thought, came forward with enough horsepower. They had convinced the ASTA, American Side Travel Agents, to join with them, and where they would bring forth and put in most of the money, and I think they had CDC backing them, if my memory serves me right. And they would build this infrastructure. And they were many of them had worked on not only PARS, but IPARS, and so they had a good history of knowing the technology and how to deploy it, I thought. I was concerned that, they would succeed, that they would be an intermediary between us and our products. And so I actually approached Bob Crandall it was in New York, and I spent about half my time in New York anyway. That was where Jim's office was, and I had to spend time there. And I approached him on a street corner. He was going over to lunch, and it's on 43rd and I think, no, 41st and 3rd Avenue, and explained what I thought was a concern. And you have, in those days it was a much looser organization. You really did. You talked to people, and so Bob thought it was an issue, and so we sat down and tried to figure out, okay, what approach do we take? ASTA was having a annual convention in Rio, and Bob, not only as a result of my conversation with him, we sat and he called a few of the other airlines, including United, and we formulated a plan. We had to go to the CAB for permission. When we used a lot of historical data of what had happened in the others, and I was involved I essentially led that, the effort of trying to get the other airlines, trying to set up an organization structure, figuring out how to do it, how to operate in the frameworks and all those kind of things. And then the CAB gave us permission. We had to file all kinds of documents and get, tons of, myriad of things we had to do in those days in a regulated world to even get them to allow us to do it. They had the course. They thought it was in the public interest and that we do so. And as long as we kept it, quote, non-political, non-technology political, as long as they had someone that could come in and look over our shoulder, and so they essentially gave us, I think this was, I think we approached them initially, I think the ASTA convention was something like September. I know I spent most of the month of December laying, defining the roles and the plans and so forth, and I think we got permission, and I started right around the 1st of January in 75 or something along those lines. We had financial support from a number of folks. We had people from a number of other airlines. United insisted we do it in Chicago or in their environments. We catered an awful lot to United in those days. And had some of their folks, Pan Am, other, they're good industry cross-section. We had some industry consultants. We figured quickly that, it had to be an IBM platform, so we had people from IBM and his technology folks, and we brought in other consultants, and ASTA, of course, was there, and so we operated it for about, it took us about 6 months to do the studies, and came forward what we thought was a plan that figured out, that it was technically feasible. There was no reason you couldn't do it. I mean, it was basically a stripped-down reservation system. That, economically, we looked at all the savings and so forth. They appeared to be reasonably largely distributed. 50-50 airlines had a lot of advantages. The travel agents had a lot of advantages. We thought that could be, financed in some form. And we thought, it could be operated. It had a number of examples, Air Inc. and others that were independent agencies that were essentially non-for-profit, and so we thought we could structure it in a way that would satisfy the competing interest and so forth. And so we made that. We wrote the initial draft, and Bob was happy with it, but our friends at United were very unhappy with it.
What was that?
They insisted that it be toned down, and unfortunately, in those days, like I say, we catered a lot to United. We did tone it down just a bit.
Tone it down in what way, then?
It was a less positive ultimate report than it was.
Financially, let's not.
Yeah. Well, let's say the conclusions were tampered.
Okay.
The sense of them were still there. Well, now you have to know, this is the middle of 75,
Right.
I think it is. And So I spend the next several months trying to find external financing. Approach Ross, a lot of folks. The thing was, without full airline backing, and it looked like that, United, and a lot of the other, you got to remember, right now is when the early seeds of deregulation were being talked about. Okay? And so from the airline perspective.
But before we get into that, on the technology standpoint,
yeah,
the big challenge that was different from just an airline reservation system was putting the terminals in the agency's offices? No?
Technically, I don't think there was any huge challenge whatsoever.
Okay.
I mean, it wasn't a technical challenge.
But at that point, up to that point, they didn't have terminals.
They didn't.
Okay.
They did not. Now, digress just a moment.
Yeah, sure.
A few of them did. Okay. American had been installing independent Sabre systems in travel agents from the late 60s. Okay. And also in a lot of the corporate accounts. Now, they weren't used in a reservation making real-time mode. They were used, essentially, they'd take in all their calls, and then they'd go over at the end of the day and use them as sort of a batch entry into the system. The few that we had in, the ones we had in travel agents, we had issues with, we were giving stuff to travel agents, so we had to be very concerned about that. But United and others had been concerned about the fact, even going back, about the fact we did have terminals in travel agents.
Did the other airlines?
United was the biggest concern. I don't know, because you got to remember, United, I participated in a couple of things from United's point of view in the travel agency world. In fact, one of the things we looked at using the UNIVAC system for was to, use a stripped-down version of the reservation system for travel agents. We just couldn't find it economically attractive because of the cost of terminals in those days. That's just a side that, I had been, been looking at this problem even going back in those days, and then helping United formulate their response to the early proposals on it. So we got the report. We just couldn't get the financial, anyone. While American was willing to support their share, we couldn't get others to be very forward in their share. And what we found was that starting in the fall of 75, United started putting terminals in corporate accounts and testing their own. So, and we had it on pretty good assurance. They'd been talking to some of the travel agents as well, that if the quote jicker system, which was what the thing we'd been going, didn't succeed, that they would step in and help the travel agents. Okay, they wouldn't leave them hanging out there, so to speak. And so Bob and I, knowing that, anticipating that it, we might not be able to find, finalize funding and so forth. He asked me to put together a plan. I think we went to our board for like initially $20 million, and this had been the fall of 75, and put together a plan so that if United took on that role, that I could have Sabre, not initially, not immediately, but over a period of time, capable enough to handle it. Now, United, and this was public discussion and so forth, they felt one of their objections to a common system was that they thought, quote, they had a sort of a 3-year lead in the reservation system. They had, as I said, they had taken the Eastern version of PARS and added to it a lot of capability. Okay, along the way, of course, we'd added the pricing or fares, the initial fare system. All of us had done that, but United had stepped way out, spent a lot of money to try to, they had quite a vision back there with the old UNIVAC system. It had a lot of functionality that took them way down the road. So they thought they had a lead that they didn't want to dissipate. And I can, looking back, understand some of that. They didn't think we could catch up because we had not been allowed to spend any money. Bob Crandall just coming in, and we'd had 3 years of no. There's a lot of things where they thought, from an industry perspective, they had an advantage they didn't want to get rid of. So Bob charged me with, being ready in case we had to be ready. So I, started laying out some plans of what we would do with Sabre to try to. We defined a system that needed to be done for travel agents as part of that study to make Sabre, be that system, or as close as we could a subset of that system. So that's kind of how things went. And in January, I think it was, of 1976, we had sort of the final meeting of Jickers, where it, United, Braniff, others, again, with deregulation on the forefront, no one was willing to commit to funding. And so we kind of ceased and desisted operations with that.
So at that point, was it clear that United was going the wrong way?
We had reasonable assurances that they had told, they had assured some major travel agents they would not be left in the lurch. Okay? So we were pretty well convinced that's what they had been doing. And about 2 weeks later, and by the way, we had some reasonably good intelligence in those days. They called a meeting with some travel agents, and that's what they told them they were going to do. And we're going to give you our system.
And what was your response?
Well, we announced the next day that we would not only offer the internal system, that we would offer one that had the characteristics of, what the travel agents had defined to us they needed in a system based on Sabre.
And that was part of your just-in-case plan, I guess.
Yes, yeah, that's what.
Yeah.
And interestingly enough, United, you can talk about people making, I think, bad business decisions. One, I think from their point of view, they thought they had a huge lead, and so there was no concern. Second, they thought that they were, I think, stepping in, and from their business point of view, it was correct. What they didn't do, one, they didn't address the business needs of the travel agents. They had deficiencies. They were going to offer their internal reservation system. It didn't contain, what we defined as a worldwide OAG. Okay? It didn't have, they didn't contain all the other things you needed. One of the deficiencies we had in Sabre was, in the early PARs in our old Sabre environment, we didn't have a car system worth a darn. United in those days was selling their technology. I bought their car system. In the middle of all this, they didn't have their right hand and their left hand weren't necessarily totally in sync as an enterprise, and I installed their car system. But the thing was, they said, we will start installations in about 9 months. So that would have been September. Kind of first come, first served. Their marketing folks were selling it. Marketing sales guys in those days were selling to travel agents, were, airline folks. They didn't know a thing about technology. The thing we did differently, we insisted that our sales folks be technologists. They weren't. In other words, they knew how to run a reservation system, and most of them came out of having worked on Sabre in one way or another, and had been in airline sales, because we had a lot of folks that came up and went through that. So we were very selective. We did it as separate sales. We didn't report. I reported to the sales guy, but they didn't report up the sales chain. We did not do first come, first serve. We picked the ones we wanted. We picked lighthouse accounts. the big guys. We held their hands. We made them, a few of them, consultants for a year, which we learned from them and they learned from us to help make it go. We didn't have all the technology day one, but over a period of a year or two, we built it to the level that that made them successful, as opposed to using an internal airline system. Of course, that made United, and TWA, by the way, announced roughly the same day that we did that they would, and so we were in sort of a three-horse race. Yeah. And others later joined in one way or another.
So when did Bob Crandall first come to America?
About a little over a year after I arrived. Bob had, of course, done a great job at TWA. He did bring Pars Live and as and a lot of other things. He had taken the job anticipating he was going to get a chance at being their chief financial officer. They chose someone else for that role when the gentleman that he worked for retired. So Bob left the industry and became chief financial officer at Bloomingdale's. We had some internal movement at American, and the chief financial officer's job became available. And so Bob came in as the chief financial officer. So I think that was somewhere around April of '73, be my guess on a time frame. And so he was, touring the world, and I remember my first meeting. He was meeting the IT folks and all the other folks as well, and he came to Tulsa, and I can remember meeting him in a hotel room, and I guess he knew enough about me, or I don't know if we'd talked, or, at least that he had some recognition of who I was and what I'd done and so forth. But he said, I'm going to replace the CIO at American, or the equivalent of it, and I'm going to bring, the guy from TWA in, Jim O'Neill, that he had, and he says, if you don't understand that and like it, you can leave. He says, because I'm going to do essentially things my way. And I said, well, I don't have a problem, as long as we do the right things, or something to that perspective. And one of the things that immediately happened was I toured him the basement of our new center, and we had something like 900 CRTs that the marketing department wouldn't allow me to install. And that was the beginning of the end of the guy in the marketing department that had blocked an awful lot of things, and just didn't believe in Sabre. It was more than that. Rod actually had a belief that centralized computing was not, from a computing point of view, the solution. He called it Big Mother. He didn't think things ought to be in Big Mother.
What was your title?
I think it was director or something like that, director of the data processing, or assistant vice president. I've forgotten what it was in that role. But I had Sabre, had the real-time computing, plus I had the maintenance and engineering computing portion. So it was essentially all of the computing, except we had a center at Lake Success, which did all the accounting and revenue accounting, payroll, those kinds of things. So you can think of them as, quote, somewhat technical and commercial, and I had the technical or whatever, right. And the other guy had the commercial activities.
So he was going to bring in this other CIO.
And he brought the other guy in, Jim O'Neill, to be his guy to look over everything. And Jim, of course, had done the equivalent of Sabre, had done Pars at TWA. Right. So we had a close affinity.
When did you become CIO at Sabre?
Oh, well, I was working in sort of a joint capacity, running the travel agent program, or whatever you want to call it, as well as my real time running all the computer stuff. And Jim had, Bob had worked out a deal with Jim he was going to move me up to the CIO role, or the equivalent of CIO role. And and we ran into some technical difficulties that Jim had had responsibility for, so he wouldn't move him. And long story short, he finally did. He gave him the Sky Chef job, I think, in early 1980. And then Bob wouldn't let me continue running both things, so he said I had to, do only the CIO role, and they left the Sabre stuff under the marketing department.
What was your relationship with Bob Crandall like?
Oh, off and on. I don't think I would have been as successful as I was without Bob. I frankly don't think he would have been as successful without me. It was one of those things where we could communicate at a very quick and high level. But I think when you look back, business perspective, and even there were personal things, but we spent time and knew each other well and those sides of things. I think we got a lot done. So I think we changed an awful lot of the way travel was made and sold. I think we did an awful lot, even internal in the airline, that we haven't even talked about. I did all the operational systems that are still being used today in terms of building those. I had and he didn't know a lot about those, but at least he supported me in making things happen. When he asked me to come back to do not only Sabre, but to try to expand the footprint of Sabre into technology. We've done, we ended up doing the French Railroad. We did the Serena deal. I mean, there were a lot of business things that the Sabre Holdings group today is based on I came in to build.
Now, you left before the internet took off for proper, but you did a lot of work that was really a precursor to it.
Well, I left, you mean when I retired?
Yeah.
Yeah. I retired in, whatever it was.
From Sabre.
Yeah, from Sabre in I think it was 95. The internet was just nascent in those days. But we had been involved in trying to take the distribution of travel, if I can use that in a broad sense, and other things from, let's say, intermediaries directly to the individual. I'd spent probably close to $1 million a year on something we called Easy Sabre, starting in, it was probably around 85, 86 that we introduced it. And there were a lot of dial-up networks in those days that were into things. I think we were at one time up on 19 or 20. There was a joint effort between Sears and IBM, and initially CBS, called Prodigy. I think someone corrected me earlier. It was initially called Trinity or something like that with a 3. We were asked to join that. We spent a lot of effort on that and came to the conclusion as a business, as an airline, we just didn't have a long-term goal. Now, the internet with universal access and in use just had not been, and you can even argue today that technically it's not a very sophisticated approach. It happens to be one that works, and it happens to be one that's, has taken off. But the concept of making things easy to use, quick to use, convenient to use was something that we were all, I think, trying to encourage. The couple of years before I retired, I had turned most of the operational stuff over to Kathy. And I was spending a lot of time trying to get Sabre either sold, and we had a lot of issues with the pilots that precluded that for a number of years. I think it took 2 or 3 years after I left before. And when I say either sold or made public, or try to leverage or try to bring to the shareholders some of the advantage we'd created and get something out of it. But I always kept a few special projects along the way that I kind of focused on. And one of them was what became the precursor to Travelocity. Ended up, it was earlier folks, but eventually Terry Jones ended up and inheriting it. And
what was that called?
I've forgotten what we call it. I don't even remember the internal names on those things. But the idea was, again, to take, we were stepping outside, and we tried to keep it outside of Sabre proper, because we knew that if it, just the inevitable things of what happened, if you include something in an organization, that's new, it's going to get killed, or the likelihood is it will get killed and never see the light of day. So that's what we were trying to do. It was established some sort of a greenfield thing, which is, really the way Sabre came about. Right. If you, the political battles we had to fight internally to keep Sabre alive in the early days, what we call STAN, or Travel Information Network. There was nobody in the finance department that, thought we ought to live. And so, and not many in some of the operations department. You got to remember, first 20 million, and then we went back for 20 more in less than 2 years, and I've forgotten what the ultimate amount of money spent before we, actually we ended up dividending up several $100 million. So the airline, won back in spades many, many times what they ever invested. And that doesn't even count the base revenues they got. I'm just talking about the dividends they got. But a lot of, there were just, the airline folks wouldn't spend money on airplanes. You could understand it, and not spend money on technology, or not for travel agents and others.
You left Sabre to go to Bank of America.
I did in 1982. Again, I was what you might call CIO.
Right.
Like I say, they wouldn't let me keep both. and I missed doing business, the business side of it. And I guess I was flattered that here was the largest bank in the world in those days, looking for a CIO, and you asked the role. And it was a combination of operational bank business as well as the technology side. It was one where they had a fractured environment in terms of IT and even some of the operational stuff. And they were looking for somebody to try to pull, things together. And a huge, and you think about it, you looked at other banks, and it was just a personal opportunity from that aspect. Also, from a financial point of view, the airlines were very poor payers. This was the early 80s. Again, not, I guess, too dissimilar from some of the same issues that are facing them today. They face a very hard time in being competitive in non, let's say, airline-related functions. Right. And so, in fact, I think all the guys at American were the officers, when they were very charitable. They had a lot of nice things to me, because after that, they all got big raises the next year.
So after Bank of America, did you come back?
Al Casey retired, and Bob took over as CEO. He had been president and COO. We got into some conversations, and along the way, the bank was running into some real problems. There was some question in those days if the bank was going to survive. They had recycled some loans from the early 70s into third world countries. Those loans had gone away. They'd done that at the behest of the government. Long story short, there was a question there. The bank was in some financial difficulties, and you weren't sure where things were going to go. And Bob offered me an opportunity to come back, run the business side, run the technical side, and create additional businesses that involved technology. And so, in effect, becoming my own whatever you want to call them, venture capitalist, so to speak, with the airline backing it. And that's what we did. And there was in one way, it was very comfortable to do it, and I think it was fun. I think there were a lot of things we did after coming back, and changing a lot of the technology and trying to upgrade it and extending it worldwide, and from a business point of view, and taking and trying to extend it into direct distribution and a host of things. So, well, you ask about people I've had the opportunity to interact with during the last 30 or 40 years that are certainly household names and in technology, in the annals of technology, and like I say, I think I've been very fortunate to be where I was when I was, to find something I enjoyed doing that I was at least partly capable of doing, and find a huge group of people to work with, and people support ideas and so forth, that gave me the opportunity to, I think, just meet most of the people that we know of that found the industry. I could probably give you 20 names, but I might give you just a few that I did run into that are still memorable to me. And I think the first I would put on the list is a woman named Grace Murray Hopper, Admiral Hopper. She died, I think, as an admiral, and she must have been close to 90 years old. She was one of the first programmers. The bug came from an actual bug that was in a computer that I think the old Inovac she was testing on, and I had the great fortune to run her because of our last names, and which was her husband's name, but we at least on more than one occasion talked, and she was really a visionary, and just way ahead, and helped develop COBOL, helped so much in the way of technology. So I any list of people that I talked about, if I didn't include her, I think I'd be bad. The one that, of course, everybody knows today is, Bill Gates. And my first meeting with Bill, I think, I was in an organization called the Research Board, which was probably 20 CIOs, if you can call us that, when it was formed in the mid to late 70s, and I joined it about 1980. And one of the things they did, because it was an opportunity for the kind of the key technology guys that were up and coming, including the old ones, of course, IBM and the big guys, but even the young ones, would come to one of our meetings, which we'd have about once a year, and we'd get to interact with them on a very personal basis and thoughtful basis. They'd be asked to present, their vision of where things were going and what they were doing in terms of product and so forth. And so in that situation, I got to meet a lot of them. And then in the roles I had as CIO, both at American and then at Bank of America, I was a key, guy they wanted to sell to, and could buy a lot of products. So those opportunities just happened. But so the second guy I think I would mention would be Bill Gates. And I think I don't remember if it was at a research board meeting or may have been when I was at Bank of America in the early 80s. But because I was very interested in desktop technology there, and we were pushing, we had an early email system that we were pushing to be heavily used, and so I was involved with any personal computer that could work, and obviously Bill had a lot. And then Bill, I think probably off and on every year or two for 10 or 15 years would be at the research board, and we would have discussions, and so Bill actually came and called on me a couple of times as a customer, because we were a big customer. So I knew him in those senses. We had interesting debates off and on as we went along, because his idea was that eventually you could stack a bunch of little computers together and add them together, and you'd end up with the equivalent of Sabre. And I kept telling him he didn't really understand the problem. He kept trying. He went out and bought most of the DEC people to come in and to help build operating systems to eventually get there. And that may eventually be a solution. I don't know how much of it will run on Microsoft software, but a good chunk may. I mean, theoretically you can get part of the way there. I'm not sure you could ever handle Sabre volumes through that. But anyway, Bill was, I think, anything you see, he's very straightforward, very insightful, ask questions. We'll debate. I mean, you can have good discussions, and I don't think I ever changed his mind on anything, but he didn't change mine either. But anyway, it was Phil was a very nice guy, very good guy to talk to, very fun. Another guy I think you asked about earlier was Scott McNeely. Now, Scott was one that I did meet early on at B of A because he was just getting Sun started when I was out on the West Coast, and we had some relationship a little bit with Kleiner Perkins at the bank, and they were the guys that were helping fund him, and so I looked at some of his technology. It was a little too early for us at the bank, but then at American later, when I was meeting him through the research board, we did actually, I think, bring in some of his Sun boxes and some of our limited application areas. I think some of the crew scheduling and stuff, things like that. But Scott was, I accused him of being the Genghis Khan of computerdom, because he was the first guy that started introducing new products so quickly that you didn't even have time to, turn the old one on. And so it created, if you were doing 5-year amortizations, as we were in those days, it created, some concern with our auditors from time to time, were we really using appropriate depreciation policies, and if you weren't, well, that put you in a bind, and it put competitors in a bind as well, because they weren't used to rolling it out, and so we had all this other kind of falderall. But Scott was one of those guys that I don't know that I've ever seen a more energetic individual, and one that just challenged everybody and everything. He thought he loved nothing more than a good confrontation, and would try to instigate. I shouldn't say that. Maybe he didn't try to instigate, but he sure didn't back away from starting things. And he was right in a lot of things. Unfortunately, I think his strategy over the last several years probably has proven not to be as where he thought he would go, as he kind of got boxed in by competitors. But always a fun person to get involved with, and like I say, knows a lot about technology and knows a lot about golf as well. Another one you asked about was Ross Perot. Now, Ross and I go back way back. I was at Shell back in the until the early mid-'60s, and I was at Shell in New York. I'd gone up from Houston for a couple of years and doing various things, and there was Ross had a guy there in the New York office. They had a couple of accounts they were trying to sell or they'd sold, and the way they recruited in those days was very much one-on-one, and and everybody recruited. I mean, this was built from the the bootstraps up. And these guys called me, and I wasn't, I kept turning them off and so forth. And then one day I get a call from EDS and in Texas, and it's Ross Perot. And would you consider coming down and talking to us? Well, I don't know. It just caught me in between situations, so okay, so I flew down to Dallas from New York, and into Love Field, and I remember I went over to they had a motel that's just still across the field where I was supposed to go. And I guess they had someone meeting me, but they didn't recognize me, or somehow that messed up. But long story short, they found me, and so went over and saw Ross. It was just, it was still early in the day. It was before lunch, so we went to a Mexican restaurant for lunch, El Phoenix. I can still remember the location, with a couple of his VPs. So Ross started in on a little bit of a, hard sell of, why and so forth. So they took me around in the afternoon, and then later on, we went to Mitch Hart, who was at that time a senior guy, later became president of EDS, for dinner. Ross did not go to the dinner, but Mitch and the other couple of guys that were there pressed me to make a decision and join them. And Ross called during the middle of dinner, to find out, or right after dinner, to see if so long story short, I did agree to join them, and I think I was in Dallas about 2 weeks later. I mean, I didn't give Shell much of an opportunity to counter when I told at that time I was a couple of levels down from the CFO where the data processing reported, and I told the CFO, because he called me in, and he called me a dumb SOB for taking a risk with this little company, and in fact told me they were getting ready to ship me off to Holland, where the Shell's corporate headquarters was, Shell Universe. But anyway, that was maybe another thing. But so I joined Ross. I think I may have indicated in part of the previous discussions how at United he was not available for us to reach him, and how he later told me we had the ball on the 1 yard line, and that a half yard line, I guess it was, and that he allowed me to be the first of his employees to go to work for a customer, and that I always had a string coming back. I did try, Ross, to be an investor when I was looking for the money to create Jickers, and when United and others indicated they probably weren't going to support it, but he wouldn't buy it at that time. Now he wishes he had and I've seen Ross off and on over the years, and he doesn't take kindly to you reminding him of things that he wasn't the luminary on. But and I don't know if you've been to Ross's headquarters over at Perot Systems. He's got there's huge long halls there, so he's got about almost a block long on both sides of memorabilia. It's like a museum to Ross, and it's quite impressive. If you haven't gone, I think anybody could. I don't know a man that's collected that much about his own personal history and put it on display, and with a lot of associates that he considered. Well, now there were some that were missing that I thought it should have been there, but that's another matter. That's between him and them. But Ross is he's a true patriot. He supports things you'll never hear of for military situation or people in the military and even non-military. So he's a great giver of things, but he's as most of these guys are. They have egos that that are befitting of the fact they've been great accomplishers. You bring up another name, and I think we talked about it a little earlier, but I've got to talk about Bob Crandall. You can't get away from talking about Bob. In I think any sense, Bob is bigger in life, and just like the other guys, so many of these other guys, he fits into that cadre. And I think if events had been different, Bob could have been as wealthy as they were. But I think in all due respect, Bob was, I think he wanted to run things more than he wanted to get wealthy. Not that I think he didn't, do things to, hopefully advantage himself, but he wanted to run the best airline, the biggest airline in the world. That was his goal, not to, go out and build something, just to create a lot of wealth. I mean, and I'm not sure the other guys did either, but they may have been in a more fortuitous circumstance in terms of technology as opposed to airlines creating wealth. But maybe the early guys in the airlines did, Rickenbacker and others. I don't know that they did. But Bob, I think I indicated to you that when he first came into American, this would have been early 1973, and he came in as CFO, where the data processing reported. And it wasn't too long after he's there, he came down to Tulsa, and see what was going on there. And he had, I think after dinner or something, he had me, come into his room, and he told me he was going to bring in Jim O'Neill, who had been his. I don't know if he succeeded Bob at TWA. I think he may have as CIO, but he was going to bring him down and replace the current CIO. He didn't think much of from that aspect, and he in effect told me, well, you can leave or you can, you stick around. And I was happy doing what I was doing, so I stuck around. But and I think even Bob is CFO, and then within a year he'd moved over to take the marketing job, and that's how so much of that came around. I mean, even though you in those days in the airline, even though you reported in one line, you still got involved in a lot of the discussion. So I think I told the story when Bob first came down there. We had 1,000 old IBM CRTs sitting in the basement. I think I mentioned earlier, Rod King was the marketing guy in those days that handled sort of the R&D effort, and he also had all the service folks. He was the one that would not allow me to have the volume test when I tried to bring Sabre up, the Sabre 2 up. But he wouldn't allow us and install CRT terminals. Now they'd been sitting there for probably 2 years. You could have on the premises for 2 years because Bob, or I think it was Fred Plugi, was what we would call maybe the CIO that brought, title didn't exist, it brought Sabre live. And then he went on and created Avis's system as well. So he's another pioneer I think you could take credit for in technology. But he wouldn't let Fred install the terminals, and he wouldn't let me install the terminals. And after Bob was there, we installed the terminals. And when Bob took over marketing, Rod didn't stick around very long either. But that just gives you, again, some flavor for Bob. And without Bob's push in so many of these things, it wouldn't have happened. And like I say, we could communicate at a very high level and on a strategic basis. And if I was doing something to make the airline better, or he thought it'd make the airline better, go do it. It was that kind of a world. You mentioned a few other names. Larry Ellison. Larry, first time I met Larry, he did come to call on me. It was after I had come back to American from bank. Now I knew who he was simply because Oracle's name was coming up and it, was floating around, the new database. I mean, so technology kind of thing. And so it wasn't very long. So it was probably around 1986, early 86. And Larry was, I can still remember him to this day. Larry really had a good ego. And he spent the first, I think, 15 minutes telling me not about his product, how good or bad it was, but about his sales force. That he had hired these crackerjack sales force, people with very high IQs, very good selling characteristics, and that was, he's going to build a company based on sales, and the product would catch up later. And I recognized a little that model, so I couldn't be too stupid. But I was always, when somebody does that, you always wonder about that with Larry. But suffice to say, then Larry came to research board meetings, and Larry always visioned himself. He was an early programmer, always envisioned himself as being king of throughput. In fact, I think a couple of things can be attributed to Larry. One, he was involved with, I think it's Caltech, and created some computer, I don't know it by name, but supposed to have been the fastest transaction processing computer around. This would have been late 80s or so. And the measurement of transactions processed per second, you may know there used to be a couple of standards, TPA 1, I've forgotten the exact nomenclature for them, but Larry was, bound and determined to have that as part of his profile, that he had done that. Now, I used to kid him about, I think TPA 1 or whatever it was, the first one was simply a credit inquiry, a credit card inquiry. So you had no I/O. It was in effect, does it match and so forth. And I was trying to say, well, that's, like a peanut compared with watermelons that we, have to process in Sabre, and you don't really understand transaction processing till you really get complex transactions. But so anyway, Larry and I had these kinds of email discussions or even discussions, but then, as things work out, he became a billionaire, and you never got to ever see Larry anymore. Another Michael Dell. Michael, we were using other brands. IBM, we used a lot of their PCs early, and they made some inroads. There was a Texas firm. I've forgotten who they were over here in Fort Worth. Yeah, Radio Shack, but did they have another name? Maybe it was Radio Shack. Well, I think maybe it was Radio Shack, but they made computers, and we tried to buy local, so we bought a lot of them. Dell in the early days, were only special order, one at a time, did not go into the, what I'll call the broad marketplace. So Michael came up to see me, must have been late 80s, right around 1990s, I recall. He brought a glass-topped portable with him that he was trying to sell, but he wasn't so much trying to sell me that. He wanted to know if he produced a standard computer or a PC, would we buy it for the travel agents? And so very happy to do that. It wasn't too long after that Don Carty joined his board. And so we always had a pretty good relationship with Michael from those kinds of things. And again, brilliant guy. I think it's interesting to watch now that he's, how he's trying to change distribution and so forth. And hopefully, he's, he and HP now are contending who's number one in terms of total sales. So hopefully he will stay at least in the marketplace. And he's another young man that's given a lot and to very charitable causes and not always recognized either. So, well, I didn't mention that about Bill because Bill is so well known, but it's good to see, folks giving back, and I think they all are people that have given back. And then I guess somebody else you brought forward is Steve Jobs. Steve, I did initially meet. I can remember the first time I met him. It would have been right at 1984. And this was just before, and I met him through the research board. We had a meeting in Phoenix. And I think at lunchtime or middle of the afternoon or something like that, Steve spoke and told us a little bit about, his new computer at that time. They had the Apple I, the Apple II, and the predecessor to the Macintosh was a, what they call it, started with an L, like Lisa, that had kind of bombed. In fact, we'd tested it at the bank, and we had, people had used the Apple II, and Lisa just didn't have it. But anyways, Steve shows up, and And so then I think there were probably 15 or 20 of us at the meeting. So he, at the end of this talk, which wasn't very long, he ushered us into this next room. And there were 20 Macs, 15 or 20 Macs, the first version, and had your name on it. And you sat down and, just some elementary stuff, but you could test out. So he said, and I'll ship them home. And so he did. My wife took it, and she had been a early PC user, so she hasn't given up on Mac since. So we've always had Macs, but started having discussions with Steve. As I mentioned, I'd had with Bill Gates, because at the bank we were trying to bring technology into the desktop. And we had used a lot of, and I'm drawing a blank again, the word processing gear out of New England, out of Boston area, Wang, Dr. Wang. And we'd had a lot of relationships and discussion with Dr. Wang. And that was, of course, a sort of a word processing multi-tool, and we had actually invested a lot of money in it and spread it into networking beyond just the local and so forth, and using it in many ways, like I eventually came out with what came to the PC. I mean, it had most of those same tools, some spreadsheet stuff, as well as word processing, and we could use it in total mail and email and so forth. So that was our concept, and so talked to Steve about, for where we didn't need all of those capabilities, but needed primarily email capability, using the Mac as an alternative or an option to the PC. And like I say, the PC at those days didn't have all the Office product stuff on it either. I think, in fact, they were second fiddle, as I recall, in bringing that stuff on. And I had an off-site meeting down around somewhere in the South Bay area that Steve came down and was our dinner speaker one night. And so we had that kind of a relationship. I knew him reasonably well. Unfortunately, the next week he got kicked out of Apple. And then we went on, and as he created his follow-on computers. I'm trying to remember the name of the one that he was it Next, I guess, was the one that he next created. He tried a Slate computer. I don't think that went Go or something, but Next he tried to bring forward. We looked at it very extensively. He wanted me to employ it within Sabre. Well, first of all, communications capabilities weren't very good. It was about 3 or 4 times the price of a stripped down PC, and I wrote him a long letter telling him why I couldn't do it, and I think it teed him off, and he hasn't been on friendly terms with me since. But it's one of those things where you try to be helpful and educate, and he didn't need to be educated. So, but he's gone on to where, just think of what Steve's done. So, again, Steve was always very enigmatic, I guess would be a way to describe him. Had a great insight, great in discussions. I mean, on almost any topic, and I think if you look at what he's done with Pixar and a whole realm of things, he was always a fun guy to talk to. I'm not sure that I can remember touring his factory one time with probably the second generation Macs. And those were the discussion days in those days, why did he want to be in the hardware business? He had such a great software. Why didn't he go compete with Microsoft and win that battle first? He wouldn't see it, and so he'd take you down and show you his production line of the hardware, and you'd say, yeah, it's a great production line, but you're... So, Steve had, I think, some blind spots as well. He... On the other hand, when you look at what he's been able to accomplish in the music and the video side with a later combination product, it made sense. But in those days, he was getting killed by the competitors and just wouldn't step into, to heading them off. You asked a little bit about Sam. And I will tell you, I think you're just so fortunate to have a man of his capability leading the effort. Sam, I've forgotten how he came into the organization, but was quickly identified by, I think, anybody that worked with him or he worked for as someone that had, great potential and, and I mean, it was a lot of skill sets. I mean, he did well in dealing with people, did well in terms of, you can see today, in terms of his decision making, in terms of, so he had awful lot of tools. He did not have a lot of business background. He had been more in the technology arena. Well, in the, I've forgotten the exact years, probably early 90s. One of the external things I did was serve on the advisory committee of business school at UT Dallas up in Richardson. And we were creating an executive MBA program. This is a program where people went on Fridays and Saturdays that had business experience but didn't have, an advanced background in business and so forth. And so I, counter to American Airlines policies, I'll tell you because I ran into a lot of trouble with it. But I surveyed our people, and in my opinion, we were a technology company, and this was, a whole range of folks. I asked if we could come up with some candidates for the executive MBA program that I would sponsor. And so I don't remember how many names were brought forward, but there were two that we selected. One being Sam from Sten in those days, and one I've forgotten the gentleman's name from in the technology world over in the data center area. And he'd worked on, I've forgotten, he worked with Joyce Wren. And long story short, about halfway through the program, he up and left. I think he went with Joyce when she went to the railroad. I don't remember if she did. That was quite the case. But Sam went on through the program, did outstanding work. Even today is lauded by the folks over at the university. He now serves on the advisory board of the business school. And certainly from my at least aspect, he gained a little bit of maybe the skill set he didn't have. And I know, promoted him even before I left into a role where we, had him, tracked as a potential ultimate successor. So it's been a great joy in, seeing him not only progress, but, succeed as well as I think he's succeeding in this kind of a role. So that's what I'd say about Sam.
You've had a long and amazing career, especially at Sabre. If you look back at one or two things that stand out as your greatest successes, what would they be?
Well, on a personal level, I'm as happy, and with the operational side of the airline because you hear about it, because there's an awful lot of decisions that had to be made in those days that there wasn't anybody else to make them. They weren't just, and it's turned out that, like I say, I think it was really based on a communications path, having a common communications network and a common way of tying things together. And we even based on common technology. At ACP was not the best technology, but on the other hand, it was a good enough technology that you could use and make the things work and play together. So from an internal operation of the airline, I don't think anybody will ever say that was a great job, but I personally feel that was a great job. Mm-hmm. The business aspects of the, taking the distribution system and really creating or enabling that to occur, it's changed the way the world will travel.
Sure.
So I'd be foolish to say that now. In both of those, I want to be the first to say we had just a super group of people that helped me. I mean, this is not something that Max Opera did. You know, I was all along the way. We had a super group of people that, you know, put up with me. You know, let me yell at them at times. They yell back. I mean, but it was, we worked hard. You know, there was no stint done that they, you know, I can't imagine in many cases them, you know, it ever being done with that group of people. Some of them actually went to the bank and then came back at times. And so we had, you know, that kind of relationship as well. I always, you know, the argument today in many cases is, you know, are CIOs technologists, are they business people, or how can you have a mix? I think you need a mix. Right. I really do.
So what are you doing now?
I spend a combination of leisure and business. I serve on still 2 public boards. A couple I've been asked to retire because of age, but and the other 2 may come along any day. But I'm still on a number of private companies, like I say, 8, 10, 12, something along those lines. Almost without exception, technology companies in different realm of things, so which gives me a continued look at what's happening in technology and how it's being applied and what the market is. I'm able to serve, you know, as a board member, in a couple of cases chairman, and so you get to participate from the standpoint of the fun things I felt I did before. I like to build things. I like to be involved in building things and creating things.
Max, for someone who likes to build something, I'm glad you built it here.
Well, thanks. It's like I say, I didn't do it. I don't know who all is going to see this, but I hope it's some of the fun guys we had at the Black Dogs group a year or so ago. And I mean, those are the people that you get charged up with. I mean, you can bounce ideas off. You know, just make things happen. And so it's always been my treat to have those guys or those folks to work with.
Max Opera, thank you very much.
Thank you.